The Wyoming sun blazed mercilessly across the vast grassland where dust devils spun in the August heat of 1881. Wahkan shifted on his paint pony, the old bullet wound in his left thigh, sending sharp reminders through his weathered body. At 51, the Lakota warrior bore scars from countless battles, but none worse than the one from Little Bighorn 5 years past. Yet deeper wounds carved through his soul. The memory of small hands reaching through fever dreams haunted him. His daughter Winona calling Ate as smallpox consumed her 7-year-old body. When she died at the reservation agency, his wife Ayanna had fled, unable to endure the sight of their shattered world. 10 years had passed, but the hollow ache remained. Now, watching the blonde child huddled in the third wagon, Wahkan felt that familiar pain surge through him. The girl was Winona's age when sickness took her, and her blue eyes held identical terror. She could be my daughter. He thought, the recognition piercing his chest like an arrow finding its mark. Thundering hoofbeats shattered the afternoon stillness. "Hold there, pull them wagons to a stop." 5 riders charged across the hardpan, led by a granite-faced man in a dust coat and crimson kerchief. Ambrose Cutter, mine foreman of Black Mesa, rode with the authority of someone who took what he wanted without question. "Looking for property that belongs to us." Cutter announced, his voice carrying cold menace. "Young girl, blonde hair, 7 years old. Name's Clara. Got papers saying she's mine now." Wahkan's eyes found the child immediately. Clara Whitlow pressed against rough wagon boards, clutching a rag doll to her thin chest. Her bare feet were cut and bleeding, her dress torn from weeks of walking beside the plodding oxen. 3 weeks had passed since her mother Ellen died of fever at Willow Fork Crossing, leaving Clara with a man named Burke, who claimed kinship. Burke had vanished 2 nights ago like smoke on still air. "There's what we came for," one rider called, pointing his rifle at Clara's huddled form. The men spurred their mounts forward, hooves drumming against baked earth like war drums. Clara shrank deeper into the wagon bed, her eyes growing impossibly wide as rough hands reached for her small body. "No," she whispered, then louder. "Please, somebody help me." The words tore through Wahkan's defenses like lightning splitting an ancient oak. Identical to Winona's pleas, the same desperate voice calling for protection that would never come. His daughter's final moments crashed over him. Small fingers grasping at empty air, fevered voice begging him to make the burning stop. He'd been powerless then, watching death claim the most precious thing in his world. But this child lived. This child could still be saved. Without conscious thought, he kneed his pony forward, positioning himself between the riders and their prey. His weathered face remained stone still, but his hand moved instinctively to his rifle stock. Eagle feathers in his old war bonnet stirred in the hot breeze, and sunlight caught intricate beadwork his dead wife had sewn with such loving care. "What business have you gentlemen with that child?" His English was careful but clear, polished by years trading between Lakota camps and frontier settlements. Cutter's laugh held all the warmth of January wind cutting through bare bones. "Business." He pulled a folded document from his coat, slapping it against his saddle horn with theatrical authority. "Got Sheriff Dugan's official seal right here. Girls contracted to work our mine. Plenty of children earn their keep that way in this territory." The paper looked legitimate enough. Heavy stock with red wax seal and spidery handwriting suggesting official importance. But something felt fundamentally wrong to Wahkan's experienced eye. The signature wavered with uncertainty, and the ink appeared too fresh for documents supposedly filed weeks earlier. "Let me see those papers," Wahkan said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Cutter hesitated for a heartbeat too long and then extended the document with obvious reluctance. As Wahkan studied the questionable handwriting, Clara's whispered plea cut through his concentration like a blade through soft leather. "Please don't leave me alone." The words struck him with devastating force, dragging up memories he'd spent a decade trying to bury. His own daughter's final moments, her small voice begging him to make the burning fever stop. The helpless rage of watching death claim innocence itself. Something cracked inside his chest. The protective wall he'd built against caring too deeply shattered completely. This child lives. This child can be saved. Says here a man named Burke signed her over. Wahkan observed, noting the witness signature. James Dugan, suspiciously sharing the sheriff's surname. Where might this Burke be now? Took his payment and moved on to other opportunities. Cutter replied with practiced indifference, but sweat beaded his forehead. Man's got business throughout the territory. What payment exactly? The question hung between them like a challenge to personal combat. Cutter's face darkened with poorly concealed anger, his grip tightening visibly on his shotgun's polished stock. Wahkan knelt beside the wagon, bringing himself to Clara's eye level. Tears had carved clean tracks through dust coating her pale cheeks, but defiance flickered in her blue eyes. The same spark Winona had shown, even in death's shadow. "What's your doll's name, little one?" he asked with infinite gentleness. "Poppy," Clara whispered, reaching for the fallen toy with trembling fingers. "Mama made her special before she got sick. Poppy's a beautiful name for a beautiful doll." Wahkan lifted the toy immediately, noticing its unusual weight. Something substantial crinkled inside the cloth body. More than simple stuffing. "Your mama watches over you both from the spirit world." Cutter's patience finally snapped like a dry branch under pressure. Enough of this sentimental nonsense. He dismounted with violent grace, lunging forward to grab Clara's thin arm. "Girl comes with us now, willing or not." Wahkan moved with deadly precision, iron fingers clamping down on Cutter's wrist with bone-crushing force. The mine foreman cursed viciously and reached for his pistol with his free hand, but the warrior was already there, pinning the weapon securely in its leather holster. "The child stays where she chooses to stay," Wahkan said quietly, his voice carrying the absolute conviction of a man prepared to die for his principles. One of Cutter's riders drew his revolver and fired without warning, the bullet splintering wood inches from Wahkan's weathered face. Sharp splinters drew blood from his cheek, but he never flinched. Instead, he released Cutter and snatched a coiled lariat from the wagon's seat, his movements flowing with the deadly precision of decades of warfare. The braided rope sang through air like a hunting hawk, catching the shooter around the chest and yanking him backward from his saddle. The man struck the hard ground with bone-jarring impact, his revolver spinning away into the sagebrush. The sharp crack of gunfire spooked the wagon's massive oxen, their powerful bodies surging forward in blind panic. Wood groaned and splintered as the front wheel struck a concealed prairie dog hole, the entire conveyance tilting dangerously under its own momentum. Clara's scream pierced the air as the heavy wagon bed tilted inexorably toward her small form. Wahkan threw himself forward without regard for his own safety, wrapping protective arms around the child and rolling them both clear, just as tons of wood and metal crashed down where she'd been crouched. Sharp splinters rained around them like wooden hail, one catching his ribs and drawing blood. But Clara was unharmed in his protective embrace, her small body trembling against his chest. That's quite enough. Cutter had his shotgun leveled now, both barrels trained on Wahkan and Clara with deadly intent. "Girl comes with me immediately, or people start dying right here." Wahkan pulled Clara behind a fallen water barrel, his rifle appearing in his hands, with fluid grace born of long practice. The crowd of travelers scattered like startled birds, some diving for cover behind their own wagons, others backing away to give violence room to breathe. Dust settled slowly in the scorching air. And somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark poured its liquid song across the vast grassland, oblivious to human conflict below. "You say Burke signed legal papers?" Wahkan called out, his voice carrying clearly across the settling chaos. "But Burke's nowhere to be found." Curious way to conduct legitimate business. Burke fulfilled his contract like any sensible businessman. Cutter snapped back, but perspiration now soaked his shirt despite the gathering evening coolness. Delivered the girl as promised and collected his payment. Payment for what exactly? Cutter's jaw worked silently for several heartbeats, his eyes darting between Wahkan's position and the watching crowd of increasingly suspicious travelers. Wahkan studied Clara, who pressed against his side with desperate trust. Her small hands gripped his buckskin shirt like lifelines, and he could feel her heart racing against his ribs. In her terror-wide eyes, he saw Winona's face, heard his daughter's final whispered plea for protection from suffering she couldn't understand. Some promises transcend death itself. Some duties are sacred beyond all earthly considerations. She rides with me. Wahkan declared simply the words, carrying the finality of winter's first killing frost. The declaration hung in the superheated air, like an oath sworn before the Creator himself. Cutter's face twisted with barely controlled rage, but the crowd was watching intently now. And even frontier justice had certain unwritten limits. A man might claim legal guardianship through questionable channels, but gunning down a child before witnesses crossed lines that decent people wouldn't tolerate. "You've got until full sunset," Indian Cutter snarled, swinging back into his saddle with murderous grace. "When darkness comes, we'll collect what belongs to us by rights. And anybody standing in our way can share whatever consequences follow." The riders wheeled their mounts and thundered away across the hardpan, leaving clouds of choking dust and the metallic taste of promised violence hanging in the still air. Wahkan watched them disappear over a distant rise, then looked down at Clara. She was still gripping his shirt with small, desperate fingers. "Where are we going now?" she asked, her voice barely above a frightened whisper. Wahkan lifted her onto his paint pony with infinite care, settling her small form securely in front of the saddle. Her trampled doll lay scattered across the ground, its precious stuffing caught on sagebrush and thorny weeds. He gathered every piece with reverent attention, knowing how much the toy meant to her, feeling the mysterious weight of whatever Ellen had hidden inside its innocent cloth body. "First, we're going to find the complete truth about this man, Burke," he said, his voice gentle despite the steel underneath. "Then, we're going to make certain nobody ever takes you where you don't want to go." Clara leaned back against his chest as they rode away from the broken wagon and staring crowd. The sun was settling toward the western mountains, painting the endless grassland in shades of gold and crimson fire. Behind them, the caravan resumed its westward journey, but ahead lay uncertainty and dangerous men who would stop at nothing to claim one small, orphaned girl. The paint pony's hooves found their ancient rhythm against the hard earth, carrying them toward Willow Fork, where Burke had vanished and where the first threads of a deadly conspiracy waited to be carefully unraveled. Willow Fork existed because water meant life in this harsh country. The creek ran clear and cold from mountain snowmelt, creating a verdant oasis where cottonwoods grew tall and thick grass provided feed for travel-weary livestock. A single substantial building dominated the eastern bank. Abigail Pike's way station, constructed from weathered logs and frontier practicality. Abigail herself waited on the covered porch as Wahkan rode up with Clara, her sharp gray eyes missing nothing of importance. At 53, she delivered countless babies and buried the dead throughout 3 territories, earning a hard-won reputation for plain speaking and steady nerves under pressure. Her calloused hands held a steaming cup of coffee, but her complete attention focused on the exhausted child. "No, figured you'd find your way here eventually," she said without wasted preamble, setting down her cup with deliberate care. Word travels faster than wildfire about Cutter's business dealings. Child looks half-starved and completely worn down. Wahkan dismounted carefully, favoring his wounded leg with unconscious habit. Clara slid down after him, still clutching the rescued fragments of her beloved doll. The way station smelled of wood smoke and dried sage underlaid with the comfortable scents of strong coffee and well-oiled leather that spoke of safety to travelers far from home. "We need information about a man named Burke," Wahkan said, lifting Clara onto the porch with gentle hands. "Fellow who brought this child here 3 nights past claimed to be family." Abigail's weathered face darkened like storm clouds gathering over distant peaks. That snake should have trusted my first instincts when he showed up with all his smooth talk. She knelt beside Clara with practiced efficiency, examining cut feet and sun-blistered skin with experienced eyes. Come inside, little one. Let's get some proper food in you and tend to those hurts. The way station's interior was simple, but scrupulously clean. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, while a long pine table surrounded by hand-hewn chairs occupied the room's center. Clara settled into a chair near the warming fire, accepting bread and milk with the desperate hunger of a child who'd known too little of either for far too long. Burke spent 2 nights here, bragging to anyone who'd listen about his good fortune. Abigail said, as she moved efficiently around her well-organized kitchen. Claimed he'd struck it rich with a new line of work, delivering children to mining operations that needed small hands for the dangerous tasks grown men couldn't manage. Said there was serious money waiting for a man who knew the territory and wasn't squeamish about necessary details. Wahkan accepted coffee in a chipped ceramic cup, the bitter brew warming hands still stiff from gripping leather reins. Did he mention specific names? Who was paying him? Didn't give details, but he flashed enough hard coin to make a cautious woman wonder about his sudden prosperity. Abigail disappeared into a back room, returning with a leather-bound ledger and a small bundle wrapped in water-stained oilcloth. Found this under the bed where the child's mother breathed her last. Burke was supposed to take Ellen's belongings along with the girl, but I reckon he figured a dead woman's possessions weren't worth his valuable time. Clara's eyes widened with instant recognition as she spotted the familiar bundle. Those are Mama's special things. Wahkan unwrapped the oilcloth with reverent care, revealing Ellen's simple but precious possessions. A bone comb worn smooth by years of loving use, a small leather Bible, with pages soft from countless readings. And the rag doll that had been Clara's constant companion since birth. The toy felt strangely heavy in his experienced hands, as if important secrets lay hidden beneath its innocent exterior. Burke collected his payment at the Lantern Saloon. Abigail continued consulting her meticulous records with a troubled frown. Same exact night, Ellen Whitlow drew her final breath. Mighty convenient timing, if you ask my considered opinion. Something cold touched Wahkan's spine at her words. You sound like there's more to Ellen's death than fever. Abigail's gray eyes grew distant, and she lowered her voice to barely above a whisper. Ellen was getting better, you understand. Fever had broken the day before, and she was asking for water, talking about her plans for Clara's future. Then Burke showed up with some special medicine he claimed would speed her recovery. She shook her head grimly. Found her dead the next morning, cold as winter stone. The timeline was crystallizing with ugly clarity, and it was far worse than Wahkan had initially imagined. Ellen wasn't just a victim of natural illness. She'd been murdered. Burke hadn't simply seized an opportunity when Clara's mother died. He'd created that opportunity himself. Thunder rumbled ominously in the distance, and the first scattered drops of rain spattered against the way station's windows. The storm that had been building pressure all afternoon was finally arriving, bringing with it fresh complications and dangerous new developments. Weather's turning ugly fast. Abigail observed, reading the signs with frontier-born instinct. Creek crossing will be treacherous once the water rises from mountain runoff. Maybe you should wait out the worst of it here. But Wahkan was already shaking his head, his dark eyes distant with tactical calculations. Cutter said sunset. That man's never been known for patience or mercy when dealing with obstacles to his plans. As if summoned by his words, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the grassland, muffled by the increasing downpour. Wahkan moved to the window, peering through gathering dusk at 3 riders struggling through mud that was already ankle-deep and getting worse by the minute. Cutter's advance scouts, he said quietly, recognizing their silhouettes against the storm-darkened sky. They're not waiting for full darkness, after all. Abigail was already moving with practiced efficiency, gathering Clara and her precious belongings, while keeping her movements deliberately calm to avoid frightening the child further. Root cellars got a tunnel that leads straight to the creek bank. You can reach the water without being spotted from outside. But the riders had deployed with military precision, spreading out to surround the building like wolves circling wounded prey. They knew their deadly business, these men, and weren't about to let valuable property slip away in the concealing darkness. The crash of splintering wood announced their violent arrival as the front door exploded inward under a heavy boot heel. Two men entered with weapons drawn rainwater streaming from their hats and cold violence gleaming in their eyes like winter stars. Wahkan recognized the taller one, the rider he'd roped from his saddle back at the caravan. "Evening, folks," the man said with mock courtesy that fooled absolutely nobody present. "Understand you're harboring stolen property. Young girl, blonde hair, about 7 years old. Ring any bells for you people?" Wahkan stepped forward, placing his body between the armed intruders and Clara, like a human shield forged from determination and desperation. His rifle leaned against the wall near the fireplace, too distant to be immediately useful in close quarters. But his knife rode secure at his belt, and his hands retained the deadly quickness that had kept him alive through decades of warfare. "There's no stolen property here," he said with perfect calm, his voice betraying none of the tension coiling in his muscles like a rattlesnake preparing to strike. "Only free people choosing their own path through this difficult world." The second gunman laughed harshly, the sound sharp as breaking glass against stone. "That's so, old man. Then who's that cowering behind the old woman's apron strings like a scared rabbit?" Clara had pressed herself against Abigail's legs, trying to become invisible through sheer force of desperate will. But her golden hair caught the firelight like a beacon betraying her presence, despite her most determined efforts at concealment. The storm was building to genuine fury. Now rain lashing the windows, while howling wind shook the building's solid foundations like the rage of vengeful spirits seeking justice. Lightning split the sky with electric violence, illuminating the way station's interior in stark, dramatic moments of blue-white brilliance. In one such flash, Wahkan saw his opportunity and seized it without the slightest hesitation. He dove toward his rifle as thunder crashed overhead, like the world splitting apart at its seams, weathered fingers closing around familiar wood and steel with the desperation of a drowning man grasping for salvation. The first gunman's shot went wide, splintering pine from the mantelpiece in a shower of sharp fragments that drew blood from Wahkan's cheek. He rolled behind the heavy table, coming up with the rifle ready, and his warrior's instincts fully awakened for the first time in years. But Clara was screaming now, her child's terror cutting through the violence like a blade through silk. The sound transported him back 10 agonizing years to another time, another place, another little girl, whose cries had echoed helplessly while fever consumed her young life under his powerless watch. Not again. Never again would he stand helpless while innocence suffered. The gunfight that followed was brief, but savage. Wahkan used every advantage the cramped quarters offered, moving from cover to cover, while the intruders tried to flush him into the open where they could cut him down. His rifle spoke carefully and deliberately, each shot calculated to wound rather than kill. He was still hoping against diminishing hope to resolve this confrontation without adding murder to his growing list of crimes. But Cutter's men had no such moral constraints or compunctions about violence. They poured lead into the way station's interior, with reckless abandon, their bullets splintering furniture and punching holes through the thick log walls. A lucky shot caught Wahkan in the left shoulder, spinning him around and sending liquid fire through his arm. Blood soaked his buckskin shirt, but he kept fighting with grim determination, driven by the absolute knowledge that Clara's life depended entirely on his ability to hold these men off until escape became possible. "Take her and go," Abigail shouted over the gunfire, pushing Clara toward the back entrance while clutching a smoking pistol of her own. "I'll hold these devils as long as I can manage." But the third rider had anticipated this obvious move, blocking the rear exit with his menacing presence and leveled rifle. They were trapped in a box with walls of wood and violence, surrounded by men who saw Clara not as a human being, but as valuable merchandise to be collected and delivered to their employer. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring ready to snap, each faction waiting for the other to make a fatal mistake that would tip the balance. Rain drummed against the roof like distant artillery, and the howling wind seemed to carry voices from the spirit world, warning of greater dangers yet to come for all involved. Then Clara surprised them all by stepping out from behind Abigail's protective bulk, her small chin lifted with defiance that reminded Wahkan achingly of his lost daughter. Tears streamed down her dirt-stained cheeks like liquid silver in the firelight, but her voice grew stronger with each word she spoke. "I won't go with you," she declared, her young voice trembling but gaining power from somewhere deep inside her wounded spirit. "Wahkan promised to protect me, and he keeps his promises. He's not like other people who lie and disappear when things get difficult." The simple declaration hung in the superheated air like a battle flag planted in contested ground, and Wahkan felt something fundamental shift deep in his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced since Winona's death. This child's absolute faith in him was both precious gift and terrible responsibility. A trust that could remake a man's soul or destroy it completely. But the lead gunman was already moving, lunging forward to grab Clara's thin wrist. Wahkan threw himself between them, taking a rifle butt to the skull that sent stars exploding across his vision. Through the haze of pain and blood, he heard Clara scream his name as rough hands dragged her toward the shattered doorway. Summoning strength from reserves he didn't know he possessed, Wahkan launched himself at Clara's captor, his knife sliding between the man's ribs with surgical precision. The gunman dropped with a gurgling cry, but his companion was already swinging his rifle toward Wahkan's exposed back. Abigail's pistol barked once-twice, sending the second intruder spinning into the wall, with crimson spreading across his chest. The third man, seeing his companions fall, chose discretion over valor and fled into the storm-lashed night. "They'll be back with the full crew," Abigail said grimly, reloading her weapon with steady hands despite the chaos around them. "Probably before dawn, and they won't come to talk next time." Wahkan nodded, pressing a cloth against his bleeding scalp while checking Clara for injuries. The child was shaken, but unharmed, still clutching her reconstructed doll like a talisman against the darkness. But there was no time to tend wounds properly. They had to move, while the storm provided cover, before Cutter's full force arrived to finish what these scouts had started. The creek was running high and dangerous from storm runoff, full of mountain debris and deadly currents. Crossing would be treacherous under the best conditions, potentially suicidal in darkness and flood stage. But remaining at the way station meant certain death when Cutter arrived with overwhelming numbers. Wahkan saddled his paint pony while Abigail prepared supplies, and Clara held tight to her precious belongings. Blood continued seeping from his shoulder wound, and his head throbbed from the rifle blow. But adrenaline kept him moving through sheer force of will. Currents strongest in the middle channel, Abigail warned, reading the water's treacherous surface with experienced eyes. "Keep upstream if you can possibly manage it, and don't fight the flow if it takes you. Sometimes the only way through serious trouble is to let it carry you where it will and trust in Providence to see you through." Sound advice for floods. Wahkan reflected silently, and perhaps for life itself. He lifted Clara onto the pony's back, then secured her firmly to himself with leather cord. If they went into that churning brown torrent, they would face it together or not at all. The pony entered the swollen creek with obvious reluctance, its hooves slipping dangerously on the muddy bottom, while invisible currents tugged at its legs with increasing strength. The water was deeper than it had appeared from the bank, already reaching the animal's belly, and rising with each step toward the middle channel. Halfway across, disaster struck. A massive cottonwood log came spinning downstream like a battering ram, its waterlogged bulk moving with the unstoppable force of the flood. Wahkan saw it coming and tried to rein hard left, but the pony's footing gave way on the slick bottom. All three of them went into the churning chaos together, horseman and child swallowed by the muddy maelstrom. Clara's scream was cut short as the creek closed over their heads, and for terrifying seconds, Wahkan thought they would all drown in the roiling darkness. The current was a living thing, a hungry monster that wanted to drag them down into its depths and hold them there forever. Wahkan fought with desperate strength to keep Clara's head above the surface, his wounded shoulders screaming in agony with each stroke against the relentless flow. A submerged boulder caught his wounded leg, sending lightning through his entire body and nearly causing him to lose consciousness from the pain. But Clara was depending on him, and he forced himself to keep swimming, keep fighting, keep protecting the child who had become his reason for continuing to draw breath. They were swept toward a tangle of fallen trees that formed a deadly trap in the current. A maze of branches and debris that could easily crush them or pin them underwater until they drowned. Wahkan managed to grab an overhanging branch just as they were about to be swept into the deadly obstacle, his grip the only thing standing between life and death. For agonizing minutes, he held them both against the current's tremendous pull, his strength ebbing with each passing second. Clara's lips were turning blue from the cold mountain water, and his own grip was beginning to slip on the wet, slippery wood. Then he saw Clara's doll spinning away in the current, and the child cried out in despair at losing her last connection to her murdered mother. Without thinking, Wahkan lunged after the toy, his bullwhip uncoiling with desperate precision, even as his grip on the branch gave way. Braided leather wrapped around the doll's soggy body just as it was about to disappear around the bend forever. But the effort cost him his last handhold, and they tumbled back into the flood's merciless embrace. The current seized them again, dragging all three toward more submerged obstacles. A chaos of boulders and fallen timber that could crush them in an instant. Wahkan wrapped himself around Clara, using his body as shield against the battering they were taking from debris and rocks. His wounded leg struck another boulder with bone-jarring force, and this time he did lose consciousness for several crucial seconds. When awareness returned, he was underwater with Clara's limp form in his arms, both of them sinking toward the muddy bottom of the swollen creek. Panic gave him strength beyond mortal limits. He kicked toward what he hoped was the surface lungs burning for air, Clara's dead weight threatening to drag them both into eternal darkness. His wounded shoulder felt like it was tearing apart, but he refused to let go of the child who'd asked him not to leave her alone. They broke the surface, gasping and choking the storm, still raging around them, but the current finally carrying them toward calmer water near the far bank. With his last reserves of strength, Wahkan managed to drag Clara onto solid ground, both of them coughing up muddy creek water and shaking from cold and exhaustion. Clara wasn't breathing. For a terrifying moment that lasted an eternity, Wahkan thought he'd failed again, that death had claimed another innocent child despite his desperate efforts to protect her. But then training from his warrior days took over, and he began pressing rhythmically on her small chest, forcing water from her lungs and air back into her body. "Now come on, little warrior," he whispered desperately, his own breath misting in the cold air. "Don't leave me now. We've come too far together to quit fighting." Clara's body convulsed, and she expelled a gush of creek water before drawing a ragged breath. Her eyes fluttered open, focusing on his face with confusion and fear. "Poppy," she whispered weakly, her first concern for the doll that represented her mother's love. Wahkan held up the waterlogged toy, miraculously still intact despite their ordeal. "She's right here, safe and sound. Strong things survive the flood, remember? That's how you know they're worth keeping." They made camp in a grove of cottonwoods, building a small fire from driftwood Clara helped gather, while Wahkan tended their exhausted mount. The smoke would be visible for miles across the open country, but warmth was worth any risk. Without it, hypothermia could kill them both before dawn broke over the eastern hills. As Clara's color slowly returned and her shivering subsided, Wahkan finally had opportunity to examine the mysterious weight he'd felt in her doll. Working carefully by firelight, he opened a small seam in the cloth body and extracted an oil paper packet that had somehow remained dry despite their dunking in the creek. Inside, he found exactly what he'd feared, and more than he dared hope for. Along with a property deed showing that Ellen had purchased 40 acres with water rights at Willow Fork just days before her death, there was something else, a small leather journal filled with Ellen's careful handwriting. The entries told a story that made Wahkan's blood run cold. Ellen had been investigating the disappearance of children throughout the territory, following rumors and gathering evidence of a systematic trafficking operation. She'd discovered names, dates, payments, everything needed to expose the entire network. The final entry dated the day before. Her death was the most damning. "Burke knows I've discovered the truth. He's been watching the way station, waiting for his chance. I've hidden the evidence where Clara will find it if something happens to me. Dear God, what have I gotten us into?" Ellen Whitlow hadn't died of natural fever. She'd been murdered to protect the trafficking network she'd been investigating, and now her daughter carried the evidence that could destroy the entire operation. The stakes weren't just Clara's freedom or even her life. They were nothing less than justice for dozens of children who'd been sold into slavery. As dawn broke gray and cold over the eastern horizon, Wahkan understood their situation with crystal clarity. Cutter and his associates wouldn't just be hunting them for Clara's labor or even her valuable land. They'd be trying to eliminate the last witness to their crimes and destroy evidence of murder. They were no longer fleeing mere kidnappers. They were running from killers who had everything to lose and would stop at nothing to protect their bloody secrets. Lantern's End sprawled along the railroad tracks, like a collection of children's abandoned toys, weathered wooden buildings, bleached gray by relentless sun and mountain wind. The main street bustled with early morning activity. Miners heading to work, freight wagons loading supplies, the honest bustle of a community built on hard labor and modest dreams of prosperity. But Wahkan now knew that corruption festered beneath the surface respectability like gangrene in an untreated wound. Sheriff Mort Dugan wasn't just Cutter's ally. He was part of a network that had murdered Ellen Whitlow to protect their trafficking operation. The Lantern Saloon wasn't just where Burke collected payment. It was where conspirators planned the deaths of anyone who threatened their profitable business. They dismounted in front of the saloon, drawing even more curious stares than usual. A wounded Lakota warrior and a blonde child made an unusual partnership in any circumstances. But their mud-stained clothes and obvious exhaustion suggested they'd survived serious trouble. Wahkan ignored the unwanted attention, securing his pony and helping Clara down with protective hands. His shoulder throbbed with each movement and dried blood crusted his shirt, but adrenaline kept him focused on their immediate needs. The saloon owner was the same nervous scarecrow they'd encountered before, but his injuries had worsened overnight. Both eyes were now swollen shut, and fresh bruises decorated his throat like fingerprints. Someone had worked him over thoroughly since their last visit. "You're back," the man whispered when he heard Wahkan's voice, his words barely audible through split lips. "Shouldn't have come back. They're watching for you everywhere." "Who did this to you?" Wahkan asked quietly, though he already suspected the answer. "Dugan's boys paid another visit after you left." The owner replied, his voice shaking with pain and fear. "Wanted to know what you'd asked about what I might have told you. When I said I didn't remember anything." He didn't need to finish. The evidence was written in bruises across his battered face, but something had changed in the man's demeanor. Where before there had been only fear, now Wahkan detected a flicker of anger beneath the terror. The rage of someone pushed too far by bullies who thought themselves untouchable. "There's something you should know about Burke," the owner whispered, glancing nervously toward the door. "Something I heard him bragging about that last night he was here." Wahkan leaned closer, every sense alert for the information that might save Clara's life. He was drunk, talking loud about how he'd handled that nosy woman at Willow Fork. Said she'd been asking too many questions about missing children, poking her nose where it didn't belong. Burke claimed he'd fixed the problem permanent-like, made it look natural, so nobody would suspect foul play. The confirmation of Ellen's murder struck Wahkan like a physical blow, but he kept his expression carefully neutral. Did he say anything else? Any other names or details? Said the whole operation was bigger than most folks realized. Not just local mining camps, but a network stretching clear to California and back east. Children going missing from wagon trains, orphanages, even reservation schools. The man's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But there was one thing that scared him even drunk as he was. Said the dead woman had been keeping records documenting everything she'd discovered. Burke was worried those records might surface someday. Clara shifted restlessly beside Wahkan, her small hand, instinctively moving to touch the doll that now contained her mother's evidence. The child didn't understand the full implications of what they'd learned, but she sensed the danger growing around them with each revelation. "We need to leave," Wahkan said quietly, pressing a silver dollar into the battered man's palm. "And you need to disappear for a while. They won't be gentle if they think you've talked to us again." The saloon owner nodded gratefully, pocketing the coin with shaking hands. "There's a back way out through the storeroom. Leads to an alley that'll get you to the sheriff's office without being seen from the street." But as they moved toward the rear of the building, the front door burst open, and 3 of Dugan's deputies entered with guns already drawn. Word of their arrival had traveled faster than Wahkan had anticipated, and their escape route was being cut off even as they discovered it. "Well, well," the lead deputy drawled, his weapon trained on Wahkan's chest. "Look what wandered back into town. Sheriff's been expecting you, Indian. Got a nice warm cell all ready for your stay." Wahkan's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, but stopped as he felt Clara press closer to his side. 3 armed men in close quarters with an innocent child in the line of fire. The odds were impossible, and any wrong move could get Clara killed. "Easy now." The deputy continued reading Wahkan's thoughts with professional accuracy. "Nobody has to get hurt here long as you come along peaceful. Sheriff just wants to have a friendly chat about that reward money that's been posted. $500. More than enough to make even honest men consider betrayal. And these weren't honest men. They were part of the same network that had murdered Ellen Whitlow and would kill Clara without hesitation to protect their secrets. What happens to the child?" Wahkan asked, buying time while his mind raced through increasingly desperate options. "Child goes back where she belongs, of course. Mr. Cutter's got legal papers all proper and binding. She'll be working at the mine by evening, earning her keep like children should." Clara's small hand tightened on Wahkan's shirt, and he could feel her trembling with terror at the thought of being handed over to her mother's killers. Everything they'd endured, the river crossing the gunfight, the desperate flight through hostile territory, would be for nothing if he surrendered now. But before he could make his decision, fate intervened in the form of a commotion from the street outside. Shouts and gunfire erupted as someone else became the focus of the deputy's attention, drawing 2 of the 3 lawmen toward the front windows to investigate the disturbance. Wahkan seized the opportunity without hesitation. His knife appeared in his hand, as if by magic, and the remaining deputy found himself staring at 12 inches of razor-sharp steel pressed against his throat before he could bring his rifle to bear. "Drop the weapon," Wahkan said quietly, his voice carrying the absolute conviction of a man with nothing left to lose. The deputy's gun clattered to the floor as his companions spun around, raising their own weapons, but unable to shoot without risking their colleague's life. It was a standoff that couldn't last more than seconds before someone made a fatal mistake. That's when Clara surprised everyone by darting toward the storeroom door, her small size allowing her to slip past the confused deputies before they could react. "This way," she called back to Wahkan, her young voice carrying a note of command that would have made her murdered mother proud. Wahkan released his hostage with a shove that sent the man sprawling into his companions, then followed Clara through the back exit as guns began blazing behind them. They emerged into an alley that reeked of garbage and stale beer, but it provided concealment from the chaos erupting inside the saloon. "Which way to the sheriff's office?" Clara asked, and Wahkan realized with a mixture of pride and terror that the child was thinking tactically, understanding that they needed to get to the heart of the conspiracy if they were going to survive. 2 blocks north," he replied, checking the load in his rifle, while listening to the shouts and curses echoing from the saloon behind them. "But Clara, what we're about to do is incredibly dangerous. If something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you," she said with the absolute faith of childhood, but her eyes showed wisdom far beyond her 7 years. "We stick together just like you promised." They made their way through the maze of alleys and back streets, avoiding the main thoroughfares where Dugan's men would be watching for them. Twice they had to duck into doorways as armed searchers passed within feet of their hiding places. But Clara's small size and quick reflexes proved invaluable in avoiding detection. The sheriff's office sat at the corner of Main Street and Railroad Avenue, a squat brick building that seemed to radiate menace even in broad daylight. 2 deputies lounged on the front porch, rifles across their laps and eyes constantly scanning the street for any sign of their quarry. "Back entrance," Clara whispered, and Wahkan marveled again at how quickly the child was adapting to their desperate circumstances. "Probably guarded too," he replied, studying the building's layout with a tactician's eye. "But there's a storage shed behind the building that connects to the main structure. If we can reach it unseen..." Getting to the shed required crossing 30 feet of open ground behind the building, space that would leave them exposed to anyone watching from the rear windows. But it was their best chance of getting inside without triggering a general alarm that would bring every gunman in town running. They made the dash during a moment when clouds obscured the morning sun, their shadows blending with those cast by the building itself. Clara's bare feet made no sound on the packed earth, while Wahkan's moccasins allowed him to move with the silence that had kept him alive through decades of warfare. The shed's door was secured with a simple wooden latch that yielded to Wahkan's knife blade. Inside, they found the building's weak point, a connecting door that led directly into the sheriff's private office, installed years ago to allow discreet movement of prisoners or contraband without public scrutiny. Wahkan pressed his ear to the door, listening for voices or movement beyond. The office seemed empty, but he could hear Dugan's voice coming from the main area where the cells were located, talking to someone in low, urgent tones. "Find them before they can cause more trouble," the sheriff was saying. "That Indian's got more lives than a cat, but his luck's got to run out sometime. And when it does, we'll have that brat back where she belongs." "What about the evidence the woman was supposed to have collected?" another voice asked. One Wahkan didn't recognize, though it carried the educated accent of someone from back east. "Burke searched her belongings thoroughly before he took care of the problem," Dugan replied. "Found nothing but women's trinkets and such. Whatever she knew died with her." Wahkan felt Clara tense beside him as they listened to the casual discussion of her mother's murder. But the child remained silent with impressive self-control. The evidence they sought was literally in her hands, sewn into the doll she carried. But these men had no idea how close they were to complete exposure. "The network's too valuable to risk on one dead woman's suspicions," the unknown voice continued. "We've moved over 300 children in the past 2 years, generating profits that dwarf anything we could make from legitimate mining operations. But if word gets out to federal authorities..." "Won't happen," Dugan assured his visitor. "Local jurisdiction, local solutions. We'll handle the Indian and the brat, destroy any evidence that might exist, and get back to business as usual." 300 children. The number hit Wahkan like a physical blow as he understood the true scope of the horror they were fighting. This wasn't just about Clara or even the dozen children they'd initially suspected. It was a vast criminal enterprise that had torn families apart across multiple territories, and Ellen Whitlow had died trying to expose it. The conversation continued, but the voices were moving toward the front of the building as the unknown visitor prepared to leave. This was their chance, possibly their only chance, to get into the office and find whatever official documents might corroborate Ellen's evidence. Wahkan eased the connecting door open and slipped into the sheriff's private office, Clara close behind him. The room was spartanly furnished, but contained what they were looking for. A large safe standing open in the corner and a desk covered with official papers and correspondence. Working quickly and quietly, Wahkan photographed everything that looked relevant with Boone's small camera, while Clara kept watch at the door. Bills of sale transfer documents, correspondence with mining operations throughout the territory. It was all there, a complete record of the trafficking network's operations. But the most damning evidence was a letter bearing an official territorial seal authorizing the relocation of surplus reservation children to beneficial employment opportunities in the mining industry. The signature at the bottom belonged to Territorial Governor Samuel Crawford himself, making this conspiracy reach to the very highest levels of government. They were preparing to leave when Clara grabbed Wahkan's arm, her eyes wide with terror. Voices were approaching the office. Dugan and at least 2 other men, their boots heavy on the wooden floor. "Mum, check the office one more time," the sheriff was saying. "If that Indian's as clever as he seems, he might try something desperate." There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide in the small office. They were trapped with evidence of the greatest criminal conspiracy in territorial history, facing men who had already committed murder to protect their secrets and wouldn't hesitate to kill again. Wahkan drew his knife, positioning himself between Clara and the door, as footsteps grew louder outside. If this was where their flight ended, he would make sure Clara's death was avenged, even if it cost him his own life in the process. The door handle began to turn, and Wahkan prepared for what might be his final battle. But Clara had other ideas. Moving with the quick thinking that had already saved them more than once, she darted to the office's single window and began working at the latch with desperate efficiency. "It's stuck," she whispered, panic creeping into her voice for the first time since their ordeal began. Wahkan sheathed his knife and joined her at the window, his wounded shoulder screaming in protest as he applied force to the warped wooden frame. The latch gave way just as the office door swung open, revealing Sheriff Dugan and 2 of his deputies with guns already drawn. "Going somewhere?" Dugan asked with cold satisfaction, but his smile faded as he saw the scattered papers on his desk and realized what his visitors had been doing. Wahkan grabbed Clara and dove through the window as the first shots rang out, glass exploding around them in a shower of razor-sharp fragments. They hit the ground hard, Wahkan's wounded leg buckling under the impact. But adrenaline kept them moving toward the horses he'd spotted tethered behind the building. More shots followed them as they ran, bullets kicking up dirt at their feet and splintering wooden posts around them. One grazed Wahkan's wounded shoulder, reopening the injury and sending fresh blood streaming down his arm. But he refused to slow down, while Clara's life remained in danger. They reached the horses just as Dugan and his men burst from the building in pursuit. Wahkan boosted Clara onto the nearest mount and swung up behind her, spurring the animal into immediate motion even as rifles cracked behind them. The horse was a good one. Young and strong with the endurance needed for a long chase across difficult terrain. But Wahkan knew their lead was temporary at best. Dugan would organize a full posse within minutes, and the entire territory would soon be hunting them with the kind of determination that came from protecting secrets worth killing for. As they galloped through Lantern's End's back streets, heading for open country and whatever sanctuary they might find, Wahkan felt the weight of Ellen's evidence pressing against his chest, where he'd concealed it. 300 children stolen from their families, sold like livestock to the highest bidder. Ellen Whitlow had died trying to expose this evil, and now the responsibility had passed to him and her daughter. They would find a way to make the evidence known, no matter the cost. Justice for Ellen, for Clara, for all the lost children, demanded nothing less than complete exposure of the network and punishment for everyone involved. But first they had to survive the next few hours, as every gunman in the territory converged on their position, determined to silence them forever. The horse carried them swiftly through the maze of streets and alleys, Clara clinging to the saddle horn while Wahkan guided their mount toward the open prairie beyond town. Behind them, shouts and gunfire erupted as Dugan organized his pursuit, but the confusion bought them precious minutes to establish their lead. 20 miles south of Lantern's End, Elias Boone's ranch represented their only hope of sanctuary in a territory now completely hostile to their presence. If they could reach it alive, Boone's loyalty and the defensible position of his buildings might give them the time needed to plan their next move. But 20 miles was a long distance, when every mile was contested by armed men who had murder on their minds and $500 worth of motivation to see it through. The chase that followed would become legend in the territory. A wounded Lakota warrior and a 7-year-old girl against impossible odds, carrying evidence that could topple the most powerful men in 3 territories. It was David and Goliath, played out on the Wyoming prairie, with stakes measured not in personal pride, but in the lives of hundreds of innocent children. As their horses' hooves drummed against the ancient earth, Wahkan felt something he hadn't experienced since Winona's death. A sense of purpose that transcended his own survival. Win or lose, live or die, he would see Ellen Whitlow's evidence delivered to people who could act on it. Some promises were worth dying for. Some fights were worth fighting, regardless of the odds. And some children were worth saving, no matter what it cost the men who tried to protect them. Boone's ranch appeared on the horizon, like a mirage shimmering in the heat, its collection of weathered buildings offering the promise of temporary sanctuary. But even from a distance, Wahkan could see that something was wrong. No smoke rose from the cookhouse chimney, no cowboys moved among the corrals, and an ominous stillness hung over the normally bustling operation. As they drew closer, the reason became horrifically clear. Bodies lay scattered around the ranch yard. Boone's loyal hands cut down where they'd tried to make a stand against overwhelming odds. The main house showed signs of fierce fighting. Bullet holes starred the windows, the front door hung askew on its hinges, and dark stains that could only be blood marked the wooden porch. "Mr. Boone," Clara whispered, her voice small with dread. "They found him in the barn, still alive, but barely. 3 bullets had torn through his chest, and blood frothed at his lips as he struggled to speak. But his eyes blazed with the fury of a man who'd been betrayed by those he'd trusted to uphold the law. Dugan came with 20 men." He gasped each word, a supreme effort. "Knew you'd come here, been watching, waiting." Wahkan knelt beside his dying friend, his heart breaking for another good man destroyed by the conspiracy they were fighting. "How long ago?" "Hour, maybe 2. Said they'd wait for you. Turn this place into a trap." Even as Boone spoke, Wahkan's warrior instincts were screaming warnings. The ranch was too quiet, too empty. If Dugan's men had been here recently and expected them to arrive, why had they left such obvious signs of violence? Why weren't their guards posted to spring the trap? The answer came with a metallic click of rifle hammers being cocked in the shadows around them. They'd walked into exactly the ambush Dugan had prepared, and now they were surrounded by men who had no intention of taking prisoners. "Drop your weapons and step away from the girl," a voice commanded from the barn's dark interior. "Sheriff wants to have words with you both." Wahkan's hand moved toward his rifle, but stopped as he counted muzzle flashes appearing from every direction, behind grain sacks in the hayloft from the adjoining stalls. At least 8 men, all with clear shots at him and Clara. The child pressed against his back, her small body trembling with terror, but still trusting him to find a way out of this seemingly impossible situation. Sheriff Dugan emerged from behind a pile of hay bales, his badge glinting in the dim light, filtering through the barn's gaps. But there was nothing of law or justice in his cold eyes. Only the calculating gaze of a man who'd already decided that murder was his most practical option. "You've caused me considerable trouble," Dugan said conversationally, as if discussing the weather rather than planning their deaths. That little stunt at my office cost me some valuable paperwork. But more importantly, you've seen things that could complicate a very profitable business arrangement. 300 children. Wahkan replied quietly, his voice carrying across the barn with perfect clarity. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Not just Clara, but all the children you've stolen and sold. Dugan's expression didn't change, but several of his men shifted nervously at having their crimes spoken aloud. These weren't professional killers. They were ordinary men who'd been drawn into something far darker than they'd initially imagined, and the reality of what they'd become was starting to weigh on their consciences. Business is business, Dugan said with a shrug. Territory's got more children than it can properly care for, and the mines need workers. We're providing a service that benefits everyone involved. Everyone except the children who die in your mines. Clara spoke for the first time since entering the barn, her young voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Everyone except my mama, who you murdered for trying to stop you. The sheriff's mask of indifference cracked slightly at the child's accusation, revealing the monster lurking beneath his pretense of lawful authority. Your mother was a troublesome woman who couldn't mind her own business. Burke did what was necessary to protect our interests. Well, where is Burke now? Wahkan asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Mr. Burke suffered an unfortunate accident while attempting to flee the territory. Dugan replied with false regret. Seems his horse threw him into a ravine. Very sad, but these things happen when men try to run from their responsibilities. Another murder to silence a witness. The conspiracy was devouring its own members to protect the core leadership, and Wahkan realized that none of them, not him, not Clara, not even Dugan's own men, were safe as long as this network existed. What about the evidence Ellen collected? He pressed, hoping to learn how much they actually knew about the hidden journal. What evidence? Dugan laughed harshly. Burke tore that woman's belongings apart looking for whatever she might have written down. Found nothing but women's foolishness, letters, trinkets, that ridiculous doll the child carries everywhere. They still didn't know. Despite all their precautions and murders, the conspirators remained unaware that Ellen's evidence existed and was literally within arm's reach. The knowledge gave Wahkan a slim hope that they might yet survive this confrontation. But that hope died as Cutter himself emerged from the barn's shadows, his dust coat stained with what could only be Boone's blood. The mine foreman's presence here meant this wasn't just about silencing witnesses. It was about tying up every loose end that could threaten their operation. Enough talk, Cutter said bluntly. We've got a schedule to keep and work to do. Kill the Indian, take the girl back where she belongs, and burn this place to the ground. Make it look like a ranch war gone bad. Several of Dugan's men looked uncomfortable with the direct order to commit murder, but none of them moved to lower their weapons. Fear and greed had made them complicit in too much evil to turn back now. Wahkan tensed his muscles, preparing for a desperate final charge that might give Clara a chance to escape, even if it cost him his life. But before he could move, an unexpected ally entered the fight. Boone, who they'd thought was dying from his wounds, had been quietly loading a shotgun with his last reserves of strength. The weapon's twin barrels spoke with thunderous authority, cutting down two of Dugan's men and throwing the entire barn into chaos. In the confusion that followed, Wahkan grabbed Clara and dove toward the barn's rear exit as guns blazed from every direction. Bullets whistled past their heads and punched holes through wooden walls, but the crossfire was as dangerous to their enemies as it was to them. They burst through the back wall of the barn into afternoon sunlight, Wahkan's wounded shoulders screaming in protest, but his legs still carrying them toward the horses they'd spotted grazing in the far pasture. Behind them, the gunfight continued as Dugan's men tried to sort out friend from foe in the smoke and confusion. But they weren't clear yet. More riders were approaching from the direction of town. At least a dozen men led by someone Wahkan recognized as Territorial Marshal Wade, whose early arrival might spell salvation or doom, depending on his allegiances in this web of corruption. The Federal Marshal. Wade's voice carried across the prairie as his cavalry detachment spread into battle formation. Throw down your weapons and surrender. Dugan and his surviving men poured out of the barn guns still smoking from their murder of Elias Boone. But instead of surrendering, the corrupt sheriff opened fire on the federal officers, apparently believing his local authority superseded theirs. The battle that followed was brief but decisive. Wade's disciplined cavalry troopers cut down Dugan's ragtag posse with professional efficiency, while Cutter and two of his men tried to flee toward the mining camp on horseback. Wahkan saw his opportunity and took it. Commandeering one of the loose horses, he boosted Clara into the saddle and gave chase to the mine foreman who had orchestrated so much suffering and death. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was personal. The chase led across broken terrain toward Black Mesa, where Cutter's mining operation sprawled like a cancer across the landscape. Smoke poured from multiple stacks, and the constant noise of machinery created an industrial hellscape that seemed appropriate for the final confrontation with evil. As they entered the mining camp, workers scattered from their path. Children barely older than Clara, laboring alongside grown men in conditions that would have horrified any civilized observer. These were the victims of the trafficking network stolen from their families and worked nearly to death in pursuit of profit. Cutter led them deeper into the maze of buildings and equipment, heading for the main mine shaft, where he apparently hoped to lose his pursuers in the underground tunnels. But Wahkan had no intention of letting the man who'd killed Ellen escape into darkness. The confrontation came at the mouth of mine shaft number 3, where a rickety wooden bridge spanned a deep gorge carved by years of excavation. Cutter's horse was blown from the hard chase, and he was forced to make his stand on foot with only his pistol and his desperation for weapons. "It's over, Cutter," Wahkan called out, dismounting but keeping Clara safely behind him on the horse. "Dugan's dead, your network's exposed, and federal marshals are cleaning up what's left of your operation. Nothing's over until I say it is." Cutter snarled, his weapon trained on Clara with the accuracy of a man who'd killed children before. "That girl's mine by legal right, and I'll see her dead before I let some Indian savage steal what belongs to me." The standoff balanced on a knife's edge as wind howled through the mining camp, and machinery groaned in the tunnels below. One wrong move from either man would trigger violence that could end with an innocent child's death. That's when Clara made her own choice about her destiny. Sliding down from the horse with 7-year-old determination, she walked toward Cutter with her precious doll held out before her like an offering. "You want to know what my mama found out about you?" she said, her young voice carrying clearly across the bridge. "It's all right here, written down in her own hand. Every child you stole, every family you destroyed, every murder you committed. And now the whole world's going to know what you really are." As she spoke, Clara was carefully working at the doll's seam, extracting Ellen's hidden journal and holding it up for Cutter to see. The mine foreman's face went white as he realized that the evidence he'd killed to suppress had been within his reach all along. "Give me that book," he demanded, swinging his pistol toward the child who held the key to his destruction. But Wahkan was already moving his warrior's reflexes, carrying him across the bridge in 3 quick strides. Cutter's shot went wild as the Lakota warrior's knife found its mark, ending the life of a man who'd made his fortune selling children into slavery. As the mine foreman fell into the gorge below, his last words were a scream of rage and frustration at being defeated by the very child he'd tried to claim as property. Justice had come at last for Ellen Whitlow and all the other victims of the trafficking network. In the aftermath of Cutter's death, the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Ellen's journal, combined with the evidence Wahkan had photographed at the sheriff's office, revealed a network that had operated across multiple territories with the complicity of officials at every level of government. Over 300 children were ultimately rescued and returned to their families or placed in legitimate orphanages where they would be protected rather than exploited. The mining operations were shut down, pending investigation, and dozens of arrests followed as federal authorities cleaned up the corruption that had allowed such evil to flourish. For Clara, justice was both immediate and deeply personal. With the fraudulent guardianship voided and her property rights legally confirmed, she was free to choose her own guardian from among those who genuinely cared for her welfare. Her choice surprised no one who had witnessed the bond between warrior and child develop through shared danger and mutual trust. "I want to stay with Wahkan," she announced to the territorial court with quiet determination. "He promised not to leave me, and he kept his word when everything was scary and dangerous. He's my family now." The legal arrangements were complicated by Clara's age and their unusual circumstances, but Marshal Wade's influence ensured her wishes received proper respect. The water rights at Willow Fork proved even more valuable than initial assessments had suggested. Geological surveys revealed significant mineral deposits on Clara's property, making her one of the wealthiest young landowners in the territory. But she showed more interest in the small cabin Wahkan constructed beside the creek and in the memorial garden where she planted flowers in her mother's memory. They lived simply but contentedly, the old warrior finding new purpose in protecting and teaching the child who had become his daughter in every way that mattered. Years passed with the steady rhythm of changing seasons. Clara grew from a frightened 7-year-old into a confident young woman learning reading and mathematics from books, horsemanship and survival skills from Wahkan, and healing arts from the practical wisdom of frontier life. When Clara turned 18, she formally adopted Wahkan as her legal father, a reversal that amused territorial courts, but satisfied both participants completely. She had inherited her mother's quiet strength and her chosen father's deep wisdom, becoming a woman capable of independence, while choosing to honor the man who had saved her. Using her inherited wealth, Clara established a sanctuary for orphaned and abandoned children, a place where they could heal from trauma and learn that not all adults were predators. The Clara Whitlow Home for Children became known throughout the territory as a place of safety and hope, carrying forward the legacy that Ellen had died trying to protect. Marshal Wade, who had become a frequent visitor to Willow Fork, brought news from the outside world of the network's complete destruction. Territorial Governor Crawford had been removed from office and imprisoned for his role in the conspiracy. The mining companies involved had been dissolved, their assets used to compensate the families of victims. But the most satisfying news was that Ellen's journal had been published in newspapers across the country, ensuring that her sacrifice would never be forgotten, and her work to protect children would inspire others to continue the fight against those who would exploit the innocent. When Clara was 27 and recently married to a young doctor who shared her dedication to helping others, she sat beside Wahkan's bed as the old warrior prepared for his final journey. Age and accumulated wounds had finally caught up with him, but he faced death without fear, knowing that his promise to a frightened child had been kept in full. "I never left you," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind through the cottonwoods outside their window. "No," Clara replied, holding his weathered hand gently between both of hers. "You never did, and neither did Mama in her way. The evidence she left saved hundreds of children, and the home we built will save hundreds more." Wahkan smiled peacefully, perhaps seeing another small girl who had once needed his protection so desperately. Maybe Winona was waiting for him in whatever realm lay beyond death. But his passing wouldn't be in vain, because Clara lived and prospered and carried forward every lesson he had taught her about courage, loyalty, and the sacred duty to protect innocence from harm. Clara buried him on a hill overlooking Willow Fork, where he could watch eternally over the land he had helped her claim, and the children she now fostered in her mother's memory. The headstone bore his name in both English and Lakota, along with words Clara chose with infinite care. He kept his promise. In the years that followed, when other children found themselves alone and afraid in an often hostile world, and they learned that Clara Morrison could be trusted to honor the same sacred obligation. She never forgot the desperate whisper that had changed both their lives forever. "Please don't leave me." It had become her mission, her calling, and her gift to a world that still needed protectors for its most vulnerable citizens. The frontier eventually gave way to statehood and modern progress. But at Willow Fork, where cottonwoods still grow thick beside clear running water, visitors can see the small cemetery on the hill and the modest headstone marking a Lakota warrior's grave. The Clara Whitlow Home for Children still operates there, a testament to the power of love to create families stronger than blood and justice to triumph over even the darkest evil. Sometimes on quiet evenings when the wind carries just the right sound across the prairie, they say you can hear echoes of the past. A child's voice expressing gratitude to the man who proved that some promises are too sacred to break, and a deeper voice answering that love and courage can overcome any darkness, no matter how powerful or seemingly insurmountable. Ellen Whitlow's journal still exists, preserved in the territorial archives, as a reminder of one woman's courage in the face of overwhelming evil. Her words continue to inspire those who fight to protect children, and her sacrifice remains a beacon of hope for all who believe that truth and justice will ultimately prevail over corruption and cruelty. And in a small cabin beside Willow Fork, where an old warrior once kept his promise to a frightened child, the work continues. New children arrive regularly carrying their own wounds and fears, but finding the same love and protection that once transformed a terrified 7-year-old into a woman who would spend her life ensuring that no child would ever again face such darkness alone.